How much time do I have?
As much as you want.
No, because I know the minister is, we promised the minister to be out by 4:30, and I want to give the minister time. He doesn't need any introduction. He's the minister of people, and that's the way it goes. Jason Kenney.
Thank you so much, Salma. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Tahir. Thank you, Salma, for this initiative, and thank you for paying for it. Thank you for your leadership in so many ways, often sacrificial leadership. And make no mistake about it, these are people who take risks with this kind of leadership. And we, let me say, Canadians, appreciate it. We need you. We need your voices, your Canadian voices, your voices of decency and common sense. And let me say how profoundly impressed I am by today's panel. So many of these participants are friends of mine, and for people for whom I have such enormous respect. Let me thank Bob Deckert, my parliamentary colleague, for being here, and earlier Władysław Izon and Brad Budd. Many of the people on this panel I know have direct connections to violence. My friend Majed just told us about his own personal experience with torture and persecution. Khan Malik and his people know firsthand violent persecution. The Shia of Syria and Iraq know, as Sheikh Abbas has reminded us, of the reality of this kind of sectarian violence. We have someone in the audience, my friend Peter Bhatti, whose late brother, my friend Shahbaz Bhatti, was assassinated by Deobandi jihadis in Pakistan 4 years ago. And so there is a lot of, this is not an academic issue in this room. This is an issue of real passion. Passion is the etymological root of the word passion is suffering. And so when we hear the voices of passion here from the Kurdish and the Yezidi, from the Shia and Christian and Jewish and moderate Muslim communities, we hear the voice of too many people who have suffered. I'm so impressed by this panel, in part because I participate in many different discussions, public and private, on these issues about what I will call jihadism, the doctrine of armed jihad, and the terrible suffering it is inflicting in our world today. And very often those conversations are either smothered by a kind of politically correct series of liberal pieties, small l, a kind of refusal to face up to the real issues or to name them or to identify them or to situate them in their actual context. And sometimes the conversations on jihadism are smothered by conspiracy theories and excuses and too much of an effort to contextualize this violence, that it's all a reaction to something, to some injustice or some foreign policy outrage. And so I think what we heard today was actually a remarkable example of clear-headed, sometimes provocative, but direct, honest, and broadly balanced comments on the threats that we face both here at home and around the world. And I'd like to thank all of you for that. And it is true, as Majed reminded us, that this panel, this moment, is a classically Canadian moment, isn't it? It makes me proud to be Canadian, to be your minister as Minister for Multiculturalism. Multiculturalism, for it to succeed, has to be much, much more than just the superficial celebration of diversity for its own sake. Enough already with song, sari, and samosa multiculturalism. We need a multiculturalism that is a really, that identifies an authentic pluralism, that there are differences of belief, of conviction, often grounded in faith, but we seek to create a society characterized by unity in diversity, respectful of the rule of law. And I think that is exactly what we heard here today. Speaking of the passion, the suffering of the victims of the doctrine of armed jihad and its various manifestations, we actually haven't heard very much, except perhaps from our Yezidi representative, about the specific and atrocious violence of Daesh, the Islamic State, in Iraq and Syria. And so let me just give you one concrete example that has not received much Western media attention. I was in the Middle East this summer, in August, just after Daesh invaded Mosul. And amongst others, you know that the ancient Christian community of Mosul was expelled under a threat of conversion, either conversion, dimitude, or death. And they were given 48 hours to make that choice. And so, of course, they chose to flee. And to pay the jizya on the way out of Mosul, they had to pay everything they had. I called my friend, His Beatitude, Patriarch Louis Sacco, who is the leader of the patriarch of the ancient Iraqi Chaldean church. A church, that community, a faith community that celebrates in a version of Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus Christ spoke. And I had attended his installation in Baghdad in March of 2013, when I was the first Canadian minister to visit Iraq in 38 years. And I did so as a concrete expression of Canada's solidarity for all of the religious minorities of Iraq. And I met at the margins of his installation the Yezidi leaders, the Mandian leaders, the Shia and other spiritual leaders in Iraq. So I called Patriarch Sacco in August while I was in Beirut to express our condolences and solidarity for his community, for the violence that they were facing at the hands of Daesh. And he told me that he was in Erbil. He had just come back from Karakash, which was being invaded by Daesh, which was Karakash was the last major Christian community in Iraq. And by the way, when I speak to someone like Louis Sacco, I'm reminded that the Chaldeans are indigenous people. You know, it's fashionable in smaller liberal circles in the West now to talk about the rights of indigenous people. Well, they have been there in Mesopotamia since more or less the beginning of civilization. They are indigenous people. And they were being forced away from the communities that they have inhabited as a people for millennia. And he told me, he broke down in tears and told me that when the Christians were forced to flee Mosul, he said they took everything they could carry. And on their way out of the city, their cars were taken, their jewelry, their money, their clothing, their belongings, in some cases even their shoes. They were sent out into the desert to try to make the way to Erbil, sometimes without shoes or clothing. And he said, but this wasn't the worst of it. He said, and this is a part of the story that is very sad. He said in some cases, it was their next door neighbors with whom they had lived in peace and mutual respect for generations who told Daesh that Nazarenes were living next to them, Christians were living next to them. And he said, so they can no longer trace their neighbors and they trust their neighbors and they can no longer go back. But he said the very worst of it is this. There were some Christians living in hospital beds who were infirm, elderly, handicapped, immobile people, and they could not be moved, and some of them didn't have family, and so they were left behind. And he said that Daesh came into the hospitals and threatened those people in their hospital beds with conversion or death. And he broke down and could not tell me the rest of the story. So, as we talk about how do we combat this phenomena, let's not forget the nature of this violence, and let's call it for what it is. It is a form of evil. There is a moral and even spiritual dimension here which is hard to understand. St. John Paul II used to talk about the seductive glamour of violence. And I think that's frankly part of this phenomenon. Some young men are seduced by the glamour of this violence. And the violence in itself has that power to attract people to this cult of violence, this cult of hatred. Of course the causes are manifold, and we could spend all day discussing them. Of course, part of this is based on a profound theological distortion of Islam. But I think we know that from some of the radicalized Westerners who have gone to join Daesh and like-minded groups, that many of them know very little about Islam. Many of them know very little about this doctrine of the caliphate that they've dedicated themselves to. But this is something that has an incredibly seductive power for so many of them. So, let's begin by reminding ourselves that this is not a normal political or religious phenomenon. This is a cult of violence that is committing nothing short of genocide in our midst. And so it sounds trite and it sounds cliche, but in every conversation we must condemn it absolutely and unequivocally. So what then is Canada doing to respond? Well, we are not a superpower, and we're a long way from Iraq and Syria, and our capacity is limited. But I believe that within the limits of our capacity, we are leading the world in many ways in responding in a balanced way, responding both with humanitarian support for the victims of this genocide and violence, and with real hard power to try to prevent more victims from being victimized. We have already, for example, welcomed to Canada, one of my proudest achievement as Minister of Immigration over 5 years was launching the Iraqi Refugee Resettlement Program, through which we have welcomed some 20,000 victims of sectarian violence and persecution from Iraq, most from the minority communities that I've already described. And so we have provided that support. But you know, in a situation like both the civil war in Syria and the violence in Iraq, we are talking between the two situations of millions of internally displaced persons and refugees. So let us be realistic. As generous as we are, even though Canada welcomes 1 out of every 10 resettled refugees in the world, more per capita than any other country, there are practical limits. We cannot resettle millions or even hundreds of thousands of people to Canada, which is why we provide massive humanitarian support. I'm pleased to tell you that Canada is the second largest donor to humanitarian support for the displaced persons of Iraq in the world. And if you exclude the Gulf states, we are the #1 supporter in per capita terms. We have contributed over $60 million through organizations like the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, UNICEF, the World Food Program, and others. We have airlifted hundreds of tons of military equipment from Albania and the Czech Republic through our C-17 RCAF Globemasters to the Kurdish region of Iraq to help the Peshmerga counteract Daesh. And yes, we have provided several dozen special forces personnel from the Canadian Army to provide their expertise in counterinsurgency, counterterrorism that they developed in Afghanistan to the Peshmerga in the Kurdish regions. And yes, we have also contributed 6 CF-18 fighter jets, 2 reconnaissance aircraft, and a refueler through the RCAF to contribute to military operations, discrete military operations against Daesh. Now, some say that you can't defeat something like Daesh through military action alone, and you certainly can't defeat it through air power alone. And of course, you can't. No one is suggesting, I don't know anyone who suggests that we can achieve either objective through our military contribution. But it is also true that the military action to which several dozen countries have contributed has stopped the spread of Daesh in Iraq. And we will never know how many lives it will have saved. But this is these are militias that had acquired heavy armored equipment, that were able to take armored columns into minority villages and completely obliterate them. And they can no longer move out in the open like that. They can no longer construct dams to flood and threaten villages. They can no longer operate heavy artillery. They can no longer use those tanks. And so their capacity has been radically limited as a result of, in part, the brave CF-18 pilots from the Royal Canadian Air Force who are patrolling the skies of Iraq today. And on your behalf, I thank them for their service to humanity and to Canada in what they are doing. Domestically, what have we done? Well, first of all, a number of people have said that this whole phenomenon means that we have to be especially careful about immigration security. Now, first of all, we should note that the two most recent examples of radicalized terrorists in Canada, who apparently were at least in part inspired by Daesh, were both born and bred Canadians. So this is not entirely a question of migration security. We have renewed the Counterterrorism Act, and we continue to be in a dialogue with the judiciary, Salma, about such provisions. As for example, the judiciary sought to strike down our security certificate legislation, not our security certificate legislation that had been in place since the 1970s. And so we listened to the court, and we brought back a new regime which we believe will survive judicial scrutiny. So we are in that constant dialogue to ensure that we maintain our civil liberties, but also the most important civil liberty, which is the right to live in security in this country. We will continue to do so. We brought in new legislation, or new powers rather, that allow us to withhold passports from people who we understand to be would-be foreign fighters, and of course, very important amendments to the Citizenship Act, which amongst other things allow us to revoke citizenship from convicted terrorists or terrorists or traitors to Canada. These were contentious powers, but my belief is this, that citizenship is predicated on reciprocal loyalty, loyalty of Canada to the citizen and loyalty of the citizen to Canada. And there's always been the power in the Citizenship Act for someone to renounce their citizenship. If they decide to go and become a citizen of another jurisdiction which doesn't allow dual citizenship, or they just don't like this country, they don't want to pay our taxes, or what, they can renounce their citizenship. And my view is this: if you go abroad and you renounce your loyalty to Canada, and you join an organization that is in armed conflict with Canada, directly or indirectly, if you through your actions violently express your a repudiation of your citizenship, we should take that for what it is. We should not be so legalistic as to wait for someone to sign a form. Did you see the video of this Canadian citizen who took his Canadian passport, doused it in gas, set it aflame, and then for greater certainty shot it with a machine gun? I'm sorry. I'm sorry to all of to offend the pieties of some of the immigration lawyers and my friends in the parliamentary opposition. But you know what? I don't need to wait for that guy to sign a form to renounce his citizenship. I will take his violent renunciation of Canadian citizenship for what it is. He should no longer be regarded a Canadian, as far as I'm concerned. And, you know, Tom, more broadly, in addition to, and let me give a shout out as well to our security agencies. We can't talk about their operations, but I can tell you that we are remarkably fortunate to have such professionals working in CSIS and the RCMP and our other police and intelligence agencies who have kept us safe. Until the killing at CIJA, a decade of potential operations that have been interrupted and prevented, many that you've never read about in the media. And let me also thank those members in the Muslim communities who have made that possible, who have provided useful information, who have, when they've smelled the rancid odor of extremism developing in their mosques, in their circles, in their networks, have picked up the phone and called the responsible agencies. And it's precisely through that kind of cooperation which we, that in part our security agencies have been able to keep us safe. And it's also because we've given them additional tools and resources. And yes, we have as well improved immigration security screening. We now have in place biometric visas, information sharing with key allies. We're implementing a new exit information system. And all of this means that we've improved migration screening by orders of magnitude. The ability to deport foreign nationals. You know, I'll give you one example. There was one of these guys who was planning on bombing the via rail train, or an Amtrak train between Toronto and New York, who had come to Canada and was convicted of various criminal offenses, but for various reasons, because of the old system, he managed to get a pardon from those criminal offenses while his application for permanent residency was pending. He got the permanent residency because his criminal inadmissibility had disappeared. And this is outrageous. This was a clear sign that this was someone we would not want as a permanent citizen, let alone a permanent resident, let alone a citizen of Canada. So we now have adopted something called the Faster Removal of Foreign Criminals Act, which means when he committed those criminal acts, he would have then been deported, would not be able to stay in Canada. And you know what? The thing I woke up about every day in immigration worrying about was that someone who had been admitted under my ostensible authority would commit an act of violence like that. And so I can tell you that we are doing everything we reasonably can to prevent that possibility. But finally, and I think the most difficult question for all of us is this question of counter radicalization. Let me quote from something that British Prime Minister Tony Blair said in the Australian Parliament last week. But as we deal with the consequences of this terrorism, we also have to address, he said, its root cause. Root cause, familiar language. And let us be frank, and I agree there are root causes, but this is the point. I think he makes the point perfectly. And let us be frank. The root cause is not poverty. What an insulting idea that the poor are somehow drawn to violence by their poverty. It's not poverty, though of course our nations are united in tackling deprivation wherever it exists. It's not exclusion from the mainstream. Of course we have more to do, but we are both, Australia and the United Kingdom, successful multicultural democracies where opportunities abound. And it's not foreign policy. Now, I can show you examples all over the world where British aid and British action have saved millions of Muslim lives from Kosovo to Syria, and that is true of Canada. But that is not actually the real point. In our democracies, we must never give in to the idea that disagreeing with a foreign policy in any way justifies terrorist outrages. No, the root cause of the challenge we face is the extremist narrative itself. So we must confront this extremism in all its forms. We must ban extremist preachers from our countries. We must root out extremism from our schools, universities, and prisons. As we do so, we must work with the overwhelming majority of Muslims who abhor the twisted narrative that has seduced some of our people. We must continue to celebrate Islam as a great world of religion of peace. And a new and pressing challenge is getting extremist material taken down from the internet. There is a role for government in that. We must not allow the internet to be an ungoverned space. And he went on. But the root cause is the extremist narrative in itself. And I think that puts it perfectly well. And in that regard, this is not just about how do we combat Daesh, the Islamic State, because it is just a particularly bad manifestation of the same poison that we see from Boko Haram in Nigeria, bombing dozens of churches, murdering thousands of innocents, kidnapping hundreds of girls and systematically raping them, to Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which has seduced some young Canadians to their particular jihad, and that has claimed thousands of innocent victims, almost all of them peaceful Muslims, to all of the groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda through the Gulf and through the Middle East, the Al-Nusra organization in Syria, through, of course, Daesh in Iraq, to the Taliban organizations in Afghanistan, to the Deobandi jihadis in Pakistan who killed Peter Badi's brother, to the same affiliated organizations down through Indonesia, even to the southern Philippines, where last year 2 Filipino schoolgirls walking home from school were grabbed and beheaded because they were of the wrong religion. This is not just about what's happening today in northern Iraq or in eastern Syria. This is a much broader phenomenon. And I want to say thank you to all of you for coming together today to express your solidarity for the victims of this violence, and to all of the panelists. We can all be proud as we face this passion, this suffering of so many, that Canada at least will continue to be a voice of decency, of protection, of a balance between the responsible exercise of both soft humanitarian power and, where necessary, hard security and military power. And with your support, at least we hope to keep this land safe. May God keep Canada glorious and free. Thank you.
Please give a minute to thank our panelists, our moderator that came from Ottawa, and everybody here today giving their Saturday afternoon to come and listen to this. This is a commitment. I have a friend from Ottawa, Nazira Treen, my sister Nasima, everybody who's been here, thank you so much, and we look forward to a dialogue between the panel and coming up with some resolutions. Thank you.
Okay.